rail fans. I'm Shane Seguin, and joining me today is Alain Miguelez, who is the Manager of Policy Planning at the City of Ottawa. He oversees the city's official plan, community and neighborhood plans, research and forecasting, and energy evolution. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Shane. Pleasure to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about transit-oriented development. So can you tell us what is transit-oriented development?
It's a buzzword, but basically what it's supposed to mean is that you're building the city in a way that supports transit, rapid transit especially, and transit stations. And it's got a number of components. First of all, it's like giving milk to the bones of the skeleton of your city. If you think of the transit network as the skeleton of your city, the arteries that make the blood flow through the body of the city, you want to fortify the skeleton, and the place where the articulations happen are the stations. This is how people access the system. And of course, the transit system has a lot of components. The rapid transit system is the main component, and there's rail and bus rapid transit, but there's also the street bus system that feeds into stations and that serves neighborhoods. And they're all components of the mobility system that comes with a major transit system. So transit-oriented development is anything that facilitates the use of the transit system by people in their daily lives as they're moving around the city, going about their lives, going about their errands. Transit-oriented development is building buildings or areas or neighborhoods, station areas, not just with enough density, but also with enough of a mix of things within buildings and a good public space, public realm as we call it in planning, but public space that makes it easy and enjoyable and instinctively desirable for people to be on foot and to access the stations, and from the stations to access the things that they need in their daily lives on their way to and from home. So, it's a buzzword, TOD, that is used, in a lot of different contexts. But in real life, that's what it means. It means growing your city around your transit system and doing it in a way that makes the transit system the most easy and instinctively convenient thing to use to move around.
So we've been busy in this city building lots of light rail, lots of O-train from east to west, now going south. Stage 2 brings us now to 40-some stations, over 40 kilometers of rail. How are we building transit-oriented development in Ottawa to link up with this new vast rail network?
Well, I should start by saying that we've been doing transit-oriented development in Ottawa for many decades. Before the O-train, our predecessors from the region of Ottawa-Carleton built the Transitway. And the Transitway was like a junior metro with buses, if you think about it. And that's how Ottawa really got itself into a pattern of very high transit usage very early on, from the 1980s onward, where you had rapid transit serving, the entire city. So as you know, we're built with a green belt, and outside the green belt, there's major suburban communities that have hubs, and those hubs are linked into the downtown by the Transitway. A lot of the Transitway is now being converted to O-train, but the Transitway was the precursor, and it was the precursor in order to get more of that habit of using transit ingrained into the culture of how you move around the city. And so we were able to build on that. When you think of stations like Tunney's Pasture, Tunney's Pasture today is a Line 1 station on the O-train, but for 30 years before it was a Transitway station. And if you think of Holland Avenue leading to Tunney's Pasture station, all that you see built there came in the 1980s and the 1990s as a result of the Transitway establishing that very strong anchor in mobility in that neighborhood. The same can be said of Orleans. Orleans Town Center was the 1980s version of a suburban town center, which has a lot more density on Centrum Boulevard than typical town centers of that era in other Canadian cities. And it was all articulated on the premise that you've got rapid transit service right at the door, and that it allows for the development of something that's more urban, that's denser, that's more compact, that's more mixed use. So we've been doing that for quite some time. So when the O-train came around, our group was tasked with making plans for the areas around the stations, the first 13 stations of Line 1. So we did a number of plans for the areas of, say, Herdman Station, Lee Station, Tremblay Station, Saint Laurent, Blair, etc. Since the approval of Stage 2, we've also been working on plans for the vicinity of stations in the Stage 2 components of the network. So Cleary New Orchard, Lincoln Fields, Pinecrest, Queensview, Gladstone. So there's a number of station areas where our team has gone in and taken a very detailed look at, okay, well, what are the lands around here? What's already here? What are the opportunities for redevelopment? What are the opportunities to solidify this neighborhood and really make it take full advantage of the transit service that's coming? It's a real convenience, it's a real amenity. It'll make those areas much more desirable as not just places of residence, but opportunities for places of work, for shops, for services. And then if you take one step further out, those stations also kind of become the hub of 15-minute neighborhoods. We talk a lot about that as well these days, and we very much want to have a city that becomes a city of neighborhoods that are true walking 15-minute neighborhoods. Within a 15-minute walk, you should have access to the amenities that you need in your daily life, and or to a rapid transit station that takes you to an area that has all the amenities that you need and all the services that you need. So I know there's a lot that goes with it, and not every area is the same. So another thing that we've done in the new official plan that we're consulting on right now is that we are dividing the city into concentric circles that we call transects. So that you've got the downtown core, you've got the inner urban area, you've got the outer urban area, and then you've got the suburban area. Each of those areas has their own logic, has their own goals and objectives, is at their own stage of evolution, and we want to aim just right the policies that will sustain redevelopment and the kind of placemaking that will support the network, support the stations, and seed the conditions for 15-minute neighborhoods around them.
So we're seeing a lot of interesting transit-oriented developments being completed, in progress, or just starting out at various locations across the city. A good example is the Frontier development near Blair Station with their high-rise towers. Another one is the Trinity Towers at Bayview. How would you characterize the success of TOD thus far in Ottawa, and how does it compare to what is being done elsewhere?
I think Ottawa is one of the cities in Canada that is at the forefront of good TOD development, simply because, as I said, we've been able to build on a very strong transit culture so far. We're different as well from cities in the U.S. where transit systems outside of the biggest centers, Boston, New York, Chicago, are not as prominent in people's habits and mobility habits especially. So I think, we've been lucky to have very strong transit use in Ottawa. We have a city of neighborhoods already. So if you look at, the neighborhoods that are in hottest demand are the neighborhoods that have good traditional main streets, good array of shops and services, and those also in a lot of cases happen to be served by rapid transit stations. So there's a lot of things that come together. There's also a lot of opportunity. I think both along lines 1 and 2 and line 3 in the futures, going west, there's a lot of sites that can stand to redevelop. So, we talk about Bayview, we talk about Blair. Blair is an interesting case because it's one of these shopping malls from the 80s that is now going through, let's say, a new layer of development. It's almost like the folks who own those large malls, those large sites, are looking to reinterpret their property in light of the service that is now being delivered through rapid transit. In that respect, we're no stranger to the trend. It's a trend that you can see in larger cities, in Toronto, in Montreal, in Vancouver. A lot of the 1970s, 1980s malls are going through redevelopment, and where they are served by rapid transit, that trend usually produces something that's much more pedestrian friendly, much more mixed use. It it starts to look more like a mini downtown and less like a big parking lot with a one-story shopping mall in the middle, if you follow. So what you're seeing at Blair Station, I think, is just the beginning. And over the next 20, 30 years, you're going to see a lot more of that. Lincoln Fields is going to follow, South Keys is going to follow, and a number of others as well. I think Saint Laurent, in a number of cases, have asked us questions. I don't think that they've moved as quickly as others. Because they have a number of commitments on their property, but it's only a matter of time before you see sites like that really start to redevelop and add more things. I think it's interesting as well. I mean, as retail is now being really, really challenged by online, and that's been accelerated by the COVID pandemic, the whole deployment of retail and bricks and mortar is going to be something that we need to follow very closely. It's going to change. Probably big box stores will be the most affected because they're very big buildings that cost a lot to heat and to cool and a lot of inventory to keep in them and a lot of staff to keep in them. And if people are just using big box stores to showroom and then they buy online anyways, we can see that a lot of sites that have big box malls may become candidates for redevelopment. And in that case, we would encourage redevelopment to have more diversity of uses, range of things that you find on that site, not just retail, but also housing, also jobs, also parks, also public space. And that starts to build the city with all of the components of a 15-minute neighborhood. What makes transit work is that each station is a destination, is a neighborhood. You don't have just one thing there, you have a number of things there. You get off the station and you have a real neighborhood at your fingertips that you can walk to. And that's very much the model we're trying to follow.
Montreal, the metro, the underground city that they have, the RESO, you can go downtown into the core business district or the commercial district. You can walk from Peel Station to McGill to Bonaventure to Square Victoria, Place d'Armes, all the way up to Place des Arts. 6 stations, 30, 45-minute walk from end to end. You're passing through countless stores, countless retail. And now we're starting to see in Ottawa how the arrival of the O train, the downtown tunnel, has allowed us to connect Place de Ville to transit directly. The Sun Life building, the 155 Queen Heritage building, the Winners, Rideau Center, all the properties are adjacent to that. It's a start, but a lot of buildings in this region have been built in the last 20, 30 years, some a little more recently than that. So what kind of direction or interest does the city have to try and get more of a network built downtown? Is that something that the city wants to see happen? An underground city, an underground pedestrian connections from building to building. How do you see that evolving? Is that something that can happen?
I mean, it's definitely something that can happen, and it has to be initiated by the owners of buildings largely, because those owners would be the ones who would apply to the city for connections. But if you take the example of Montreal, I know for a fact that speaking with my colleagues in Montreal, there have been very vigorous debates about the RESO. It is convenient. And we're in winter cities, so it definitely lets people, move indoors without being exposed to the cold, and obviously there's an enjoyment to that. But the effect on street life can be profound as well. And those are things that really need to be balanced. Our downtown core already was known for a lot of streets that were in difficulty. As the capital of a major city in a G7 country, you want people to come to your downtown and have a sense of, people and crowds and animation on the street. And if everybody's in a tunnel and your streets are deserted, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. We have to really be careful to not lose one as we do the other. If you go to Montreal, for instance, St. Catherine Street, notwithstanding the COVID disaster that's hitting them right now, St. Catherine Street is very active, it's very dynamic, and people tend to follow St. Catherine Street east to west. But as a pedestrian, if you go from St. Catherine Street to René Lévesque and then down south, and then you want to walk to Old Montreal, you're going to go through some streets that are pretty desolate. And I guess the question to be asked is, when they started doing this in Montreal, what was there before? And if you talk to planners in Montreal, what was there before is that all the streets in downtown Montreal were vibrant and active. The northwest streets, the north-south street, as well as the east-west ones. And with the RESO, a lot of the north-south ones died or were seriously affected. The Maisonneuve Street, for instance, was almost like a parallel to St. Catherine, and it has had its level of activity really come down. Sherbrooke, it's uphill, so for people to hike it up to Sherbrooke, I mean, it's a pedestrian effort. Not everybody will do it, but once you're up there, it belongs to a different neighborhood. In Toronto, the same thing. I mean, it took years and years and years for the amount of density that they've built in Toronto to compensate for the amount of activity that migrated to the tunnels and initially really affected the streets on the surface. We have to remember, I mean, Yonge Street is a dynamic and very active place now, but for a long time in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of sketchy. Yonge Street had stretches where not everybody would venture at night. It's different now because of the huge boom in population. But I think we have to be careful to not rush into something that could have counterbalancing effects on something that the city should always be able to count on, which is a lively downtown core with just that feeling of people just walking on the sidewalk. We're a winter city. We should be able to bundle up and walk outside. And at the downtown core, there's a store entrance or an office entrance every 5 meters. You can deke in if you're that cold. You can grab a coffee or something, but to move everybody underground automatically risks depriving the street of a lot of life. So it's not like we don't want it, but I think it's something that we have to balance with a number of other things as well.
So you definitely make some good points. We have seen on Spark Street how the retail on that street, among other factors, is very difficult to sustain, and a lot of other streets downtown in comparison in that region have struggles as well. So those are definitely valid points and all that. Moving further than that, is there a direction when these buildings do renovate, when they do get replaced? Is there some direction from the city to encourage them to connect in, or is it really up to their discretion? What kind of position does the city have on that side of things at this time?
Actually, right now there is no encouragement or there is no policy that people should do this, but there is a policy that would govern how we would respond if we are asked. So if there's a building owner that wants to connect to a station, there's a procedure that they can follow, and they would speak to OC Transpo, and there's certain levels of engineering that need to be done if you're coming within a certain distance of the tunnel. And there's basically a process that you would follow for accessing a city underground facility, be it station or corridor. But beyond that, there is no plan or directive or requirement or policy that says this should be done.
Now, moving outside of the downtown, how is development being fostered and directed at this time? Is land being given to developers to build condos near towers near stations, or is there a vision behind it to ensure that it's practical, that there's convenient links to these buildings and to the stations?
I mean, land is not given. Land is already owned, and whoever owns it would be, I guess, looking at what the city is planning near a station to see what their permissions are. So what the city would do typically is, let's take, for example, the Cleary New Orchard study, which now I guess should change names to recognize the renaming of Cleary Station to Sherbourne Station. But we did a plan for those two stations and the areas around those two stations. And before the O train, the zoning contemplated, what it contemplated prior. I don't remember what that was, but probably would treat that street as just a regular, ordinary street without rapid transit service. With the planning of the stations, we looked at all the lands, and we looked at the opportunity for, in this particular case, take Westboro and stretch it westward. So, Westboro kind of ends at around, Dominion Street, Berkeley Street, around there, and then you've got the retirement home and the Rogers studio, and then it just kind of peters out. So the study that we did for that stretch of those two extra stations was to see what the potential was for transit to help us stretch Westboro westward, so that Richmond continues as a commercial traditional main street, that we look at the pieces of land that can support taller buildings. We have rules that would call for those buildings to be right at the sidewalk. The stores need to have their entrances on the sidewalk for people to walk into them. So we don't want parking lots between the sidewalk and the building. If there's parking, it has to be underground or it has to be in behind, but you want a pure pedestrian experience. And you want to organize the vicinity of stations as well with enough public space so that people have that pedestrian ease of movement. You also want to unlock development opportunities for residential buildings. So typically near stations, they tend to be taller buildings. We would allow high-rises in areas that are close to stations. In areas like near New Orchard Station, where there's a neighborhood that already has a lot of high-rises, we were looking at the era at which those high-rises were built, and they were built in the era where you would put a high-rise in the middle of a large parcel of land. And we are looking at opportunities to now allow for townhomes to be built along the edge of those large parcels of land, not to eliminate all the green space, but to leave the green space kind of in the middle as green space for the residents, but also to give the streets a face, a frontage, so that when you're walking in the neighborhood of the station, you have an urban environment where you've got brownstones with stoops that are along the sidewalk. It's a much more pedestrian supportive kind of environment, and it adds again people's homes, so that you can give opportunities to people to live near transit. Transit basically is something that gives people a choice. You have the choice of not owning a car and still being able to function in the city with transit. It's a free country. People can buy a car if they feel like it, but if you decide not to, or if you can't, you should have that choice. And a rapid transit station is the first place where you would really have that choice. So anything that we would do in terms of planning the areas around stations would be to open up more opportunities for that choice to exist and for people to be able to move to these areas and take advantage of the stations.
Now, another important thing is transit-oriented development being efficient has a radius or amount of distance around the station where it's effective. Now, we've seen, for example, out in Orleans near Trim Station, Bridgel have been building a lot of residential multi-unit homes. And these places can often, that's just an example, these places can often be seen as within steps of the light rail. But when you look at it, it's probably a 20-25 minute walk to the station. So what kind of distance would you really say is really effective, practical, reasonable distance for something to really be proper transit-oriented development?
That's a great question. And there is no clear answer. It really depends where you are. You can talk about a 20-minute distance to Rideau Station and people will walk it no problem, and you can talk about a 20-minute distance to Trim Station and it'll look like it's eternal and nobody will instinctively walk it. So the same distance can mean very different things in different places. That's why we have this approach to the city, as I said, in concentric circles. The transect, downtown core, inner urban, outer urban, and suburban. In the suburban area especially, the distances can be made to feel a lot longer if there's nothing. If you're looking at a void, let's say you get out of your house, you turn a corner, and you're looking down the street and there's just nothing. Well, it can be the same distance in meters, but the walk will feel a lot different than if you leave your house, you turn the corner, and you look at a street that is lively, that is full, that has stores, that has shops, that has pedestrians, that has a lot of stuff going on, a lot of human stimulation. A lot of community building, is not such a mechanical exercise. It's a profoundly human thing. The human mind will relate more to places that are social or sociable, and you will be instinctively more drawn to places that look like they're inviting because they're sociable than places that are perhaps exactly the same distance on the ground, but where it feels like there's a void. Or, quite frankly, it feels like it's not necessarily safe to walk because you're on a sidewalk, but cars are whipping by you at 80 kilometers an hour. So it's very, very different based on the context where you're in. In the case of suburban communities, the real challenge that we have is to start to make places out of the vicinity of stations that are more focused on foot traffic, on pedestrian friendliness, on immediate foot access to things right from the sidewalk, than on the instinctive and traditional approach to suburban development, which is just to simply assume, well, people will get in their car and they'll get there in a couple of minutes anyways. Maybe they will, but that's again not giving the full range of choice that we would want. We would want people to have the choice to also be in a place where they can comfortably walk to a station and feel like it's the normal thing to do. I don't know if that answers the question, but it is a bit of a trick question. It's
Now, some other developments in the city right now, some of the biggest condo tower projects, such as 3048 Chamberlain Avenue, 1356 Clyde, the Westgate Center, are not within walking distance of a station. So what is being done to try and get developers to build in proximity to the stations moving forward?
I mean, we're a big enough city that I think there's a lot of places where there's interest in residential development, and all those locations that you've mentioned are otherwise very well served by the street bus system that OC Transport runs and feeds into stations, and that's okay too. I mean, if you look at stations, obviously the biggest thing that we do is we put in place these plans that typically would give permissions for development that make it desirable for projects to be built. That's great. And that's the biggest impact we can have on nudging development towards certain locations. But there's another way to read the city, which is if you take a station and you go 10 bus stops away from it, what are the opportunities there? And if you're 10 or 15 bus stops away on a frequent route, what are the opportunities there? And that's where you start to see locations also start to make a different kind of sense for development projects. And those are just as legitimate because, you know, you can get off a station and not necessarily be home right away. You'll get on a bus and in 5 or 10 or 15 stops you'll get home, but on the way maybe you'll pass a number of different stores that'll let you do the errands that you need to do. You get off a bus, you go to a couple of stores, you get back on a bus after, and if it runs often enough, it'll do the trick. You know, I think we have to rediscover the joys of living with that kind of setup where, you know, you're always going forward. You know, you're not backtracking on yourself to get the car because you parked it way back there. You keep going forward. You know, you get off the station, you cross the street, you go to a store. Then you take the bus, you do 5 blocks, you get off the bus, you do a couple of stores. Then you keep going, you get on the bus on the next stop, and you keep going, and then you get home. And that's perfectly logical as well. There's an enjoyment to the traditional main streets that we have, to the neighborhoods that we have. And, you know, the transit system, including the bus system, is very much part of the public space that the city has to offer. So I would view it very much as complementary, not in opposition of.
Now, there's one other property I want to talk about briefly, Lincoln Fields. That's also going through a redevelopment. And looking at the connectivity plans that the city has released, there isn't a direct or easy to see venue or method to access the Lincoln Fields site from the station. There's no pedestrian overpass. It's a lot of detouring over Carling Avenue. So it is being marketed as a transit-oriented development, but access to it is not as ideal as it could be. How do you see that site developing in that respect?
Yeah, that's one that we're working on right now, and I think we still have some work to do. So there's no final answer that's been given, but I think you've identified the challenges quite correctly. Lincoln Fields is living with a number of different legacies. One is the very large properties that make up the area. So there's very large land holdings. The shopping center is the better known one, but there's a number of other very large properties. So already just the parcel fabric there is very, very large. So it creates additional distance. You also have the parkway and the green space. And those are kind of a layer on which we have to figure out all that connectivity. The NCC is the custodian of that green space. The NCC is also the custodian of the parkway, and the parkway connects with Carling Avenue with a number of very suburban style interchanges. So those are additional barriers. So that's a project that we have on the go right now, and all these issues are, I think you've correctly identified them. Those are some of the challenges. It's kind of a spaghetti that you have to untangle, and you have to reimagine the whole area around the logic of a transit station and how people will walk to the transit station, and how do you build their walk to and from that transit station along the street, which is Carling. And Carling is also a main street. We identify it as a main street in our official plan, so we want Carling to be a focus. And how do you take sites like the Lincoln Fields Shopping Center and some other big sites and start to break them down into streets and blocks of a pattern that is more conducive to walking? And then how do you introduce links from that to the station? So this is a piece of work that we have on the go. We haven't finished it. Obviously, right now our team is very focused on the official plan, which is the main piece of work that we're doing. But that's on our active list of projects. So please stay tuned on that one.
And you just mentioned the master plan, the official plan for the city transportation. Can you just discuss briefly how can people find out more about this? How can they contribute? How can they get engaged in this process?
So we have a really good website with a lot of information. It's ottawa.ca/new-OP for official plan. And that's got all the documents that we've issued so far. There's a number of discussion papers, there's one-page summaries of some of the main issues, and then there's the actual draft official plan that's now being consulted on. We're actually already starting to work on changes that we're going to make as a result of the first round of consultations. There's going to be more consultations in the summer, and at the end of the summer there's going to be an open house with the next version of the official plan. So that'll be advertised on that webpage. And in September we're going to be presenting the revised official plan to a meeting of Planning Committee and AIRAC, which is a special meeting to consider the new official plan, and people can participate and issue their comments there and give their opinion there. So after the official plan, there will be the transportation master plan, and that has its own web page as well, and people can provide feedback on the transportation master plan through that particular web page.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for talking about transit-oriented development. Mr. Alain Miguelez, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Shane. It's a pleasure to be here.